Hi, welcome to this lecture on Impact Calculus, How to Win. My name is Josh Clark. I am the co-director of forensics at Montgomery Bell Academy, as well as the head coach. And today we are going to cover some aspects of impact calculus. This will be lecture one of a two-part series discussing one of the most important parts of debate, which is impact calculus. So the first thing we'd like to discuss is why impact calculus is considered so important. First reason is that at its heart, all debates are impact debates. Um, the when trying to evaluate which side you should choose, be it a mundane decision about where to go or what to have for dinner, or making a big life choice over who to spend your time with or what college to go to or what job to choose. All of these things come down to comparing various impacts or advantages and disadvantages for your life. And so it's an important skill that should carry over throughout debate, but also it's the way that we help a subjective activity like debate be decided as objectively as possible by explaining what the manifestations of the advantages and disadvantages are, and the way that those get characterized are impacts. Additionally, that's how you win. When a judge just tries to decide, the reason that we have some sort of consistency in debates over who wins is because of impact comparison and being able to properly adjudicate which solution by the affirmative or negative gives the best opportunity to help the most amount of people in the prescribed value that is being debated. Also, because we're psychologically predetermined to preserve the species, discussing various ways and manifestations to do that is also something that is important, and it helps connect with something that is primal in us, because we do have a desire to continue humanity. Besides that, it creates we already discussed, it creates a more objective method to evaluate, but also extinction risks have skewed how we talk about debates. And so we will criticize that a little bit later in the lecture today. But it also allows technical, well-flowed debaters a chance to glowingly set yourself apart. Impact debates, if technical and well thought out, and well researched and well historically backed, using both quality evidence and critical thinking, is something that can be very beautiful, even if it's not 100% how we would do things in normal life. So the first thing that I wanted to discuss, especially on a topic like criminal justice, if you're watching this in future years, right now we're debating criminal justice reform. We're going to have a lot of affirmatives that do not have what we would consider utilitarian focused impacts or extinction level focused impacts versus disadvantages that may be less probable but have larger magnitude impacts within a utilitarian framework. And in evaluating that, it becomes a question of values. And let me give you an example. There was an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where Mac and Dennis decide to move to the suburbs. And in doing so, they had the question of, do we want a house in the suburbs or a small apartment in the city? And the impacts of that were, if you lived in the city in a small apartment, it was much closer to work. The commute was less. There were lots of things within walking distance. There was a vibrant nightlife, and you were closer to a lot of the people that you knew. While if you were in the suburbs, you would have a car, you would have much more space, you would have a yard, you would have more a house that was much bigger. And the thing that is difficult when making these decisions is none of the impacts overlap, or at least very few of the impacts overlap. And so basically it becomes a question of values. What do those two people value more when making that decision? Do they value being closer to work, cutting out of the commute, having a car, having that space, living farther away from a concentration of people, All of these are different values, and in determining them is what makes impact debates so important. And so when comparing two unlike things, you have to set up values for what is desirable inside of the debate. And in this instance, where Mac and Dennis had to make that decision, and they end up, choosing the suburbs, and it all goes awry and terrible, and they decide that they're city people in the end. In this decision, you have to persuade someone else, and so you have to create value mechanisms to prefer what your value system is for your impacts as opposed to those of the other. And not only that, it's important to be able to try and capture as much of the other people's value as well. So maybe you can say being able to get to work in a short amount of period. One of the benefits of suburbs, if you have that hour to commute, and you can listen to books on tape, or you can get some work done somehow in the car, or make sure you do your teleconferencing while you're in the car, and you can say, well, I can get some of those work hours back by doing that. Or you can claim a different advantage over, like, I get that hour to myself to think and to not have to deal with the pressures of work. And so that kind of de-stressing allows me to be more productive at work. And so again, you're trying to usurp some of the same impacts while that the other team is shared in their values, but at the same time provide your own advantages as well. I encourage you to go through a thought process where you go through this exercise yourself. If you live in the most fun part of New York City in a small apartment and take public transportation everywhere, or live 20 minutes away in a house and have your own car. So think about all of the various impacts that can happen, and then compare and contrast and try and usurp as much of their impacts and values while trying to prove that yours is best. So generally, when we talk about impact calculus, we discuss magnitude, risk or probability, and time frame. Now, the second portion of this lecture is going to dig deep into these three portions. And the lecture today is going to deal with ways to kind of carry out these three measurements for impact calculus. I do want to say, just in brief, if you are making the transition from maybe a younger JV debater or a novice debater, when extending impacts, you don't want to say at the top, extend our impact, 1, it's a bigger magnitude, 2, it's higher risk, 3, it's a faster time frame. All of those, that type of a structure is useful in order to teach impact calculus, but you want to make it more specific to your impact, as opposed to using kind of this carbon copy to prove why you meet all three. Instead, take the 1 or the 2 that are true about which one's better and use those. But we'll, in the second part of this lecture, go deeper into what constitutes and how to prioritize each one of these three. But today, we're going to first deal with the equation to evaluate impacts, and that is risk 1 times impact 1 is greater than risk 2 times impact 2. It's the same logic that we follow when we evaluate risks and make decisions. It's a mathematical calculation of impacts in debate. It could be considered heuristic, but it is a shorthanded for an actual decision-making process. While you cannot actually crunch the numbers between the two impacts, what you can do is provide the lens to why and provide as much analysis and evidentiary reasons why your impact should be considered larger than the risk and impact of risk times the impact of the other team. The extremely low risk logic of this can be bad in the real world. The reason is it would be paralyzing. The idea that any risk of extinction is infinite risk makes it impossible to evaluate two extremely low risks of extinction, since both would be rated as infinite. It would also create some statistical noise. The reason extremely low probabilities and correlations of things are discounted in scientific studies is because at some point the relation things become so tenuous that it becomes difficult to even prove there is a relationship. And we couldn't incorporate tiny human factors into risk calculus, like the quality individual human decisions involved we couldn't know beforehand. So that's one thing to consider in this, but this is a great equation to determine impacts inside of a debate. So right now we're going to go through 5 tips to make a good impact debate. And again, we will cover magnitude, time frame, and risk and probability or risk in another lecture. But the first one is make them interact with each other. Use compare and contrast. Some impact overviews have an interaction on the internal link portion, but many seem to forget a nuclear war would also definitely turn the case. I think today, in a lot of debates, most turns the case analysis deals from the terminal impact, but it is also important to note that that internal link portion can interact and turn the case sooner than others. So that's one thing that should be leveraged. Let me give a couple of examples. If there was a global nuclear war and we were living in caves and hunting for canned food in the wreckage, we probably wouldn't be exploring and developing different formulations of criminal justice reform. And if the affirmative solves some form of environmental destruction, nuclear war would actually hurt the environment, and that's one way that you can go about that, and also one of the more common ways. But let's take the death penalty case, for instance. If the death penalty is key to prevent eliminating the death penalty is key to prevent democratic backsliding, you can win that, the standard of democracy in the United States is key to, on the affirmative side, preventing collapse of alliances abroad. And it's those alliances and that demonstration of democracy and progressivism inside the United States that allows those cooperations that can prevent conflict from happening in the first place. Another thing to note is one impact may turn a totally unrelated impact. So you should assert that even if you lack evidence, come up with a compelling warrant. This is one of the instances where a lot of times just a conjecture for some reason is allowed inside of a debate, where maybe a card should be required if we took a closer examination of the practice of this. Also, you can't get away from just asserting on impact calculus more so than in other places. For instance, war causes disease is one that I've already heard this summer. There wasn't evidence behind it, but a lot of people or a lot of judges will just give you credit for that. The reason is that primarily few debaters and judges have a historical understanding of the impacts, and so that sort of short conjecture is something that can carry a lot of weight. The next one is to know your history. The reason is it's especially important in impact debates because it lends credibility to the speaker and allows you to explain the warrants when they are not there. So if you have an empirical example of how an impact interacted with an impact, that could be just as good and more word economical than reading a piece of evidence about how it turns the case. So if you could, go back to the French Revolution or any major or minor conflict that where something got worse as a result that is analogous to the two impacts, then you can prove through history that your impact is correct. And that's something that can also really impress a judge because it's something that's different. It is not done in 90% of the debates that happen. Also, it helps you to compare stuff without any evidence, and it creates something concrete from abstract concepts. Psychologists who have studied risk say we tend to overestimate things that have occurred just because they have already occurred. For instance, obviously now during the pandemic of COVID-19, we're hyper vigilant of various risks of spreading airborne diseases. And so some of the ones that have come up in the news as of late, we take especially serious because we're in the midst of something that has happened, even though it hadn't really happened to this level for over 100 years. But now we may be more prone to believe it because it's something that we have experienced. So applying that to your applying that to the debate can be something that can be incredibly helpful. Next is to make use of overviews. So get in the habit of having short impact overviews. I don't think that you need these impact overviews necessarily on the affirmative. Like I don't think that the 2AC needs case overviews. This may be an exception if you have if you have a framing type affirmative where you feel like the need to kind of develop that warrant to cut against the gut reaction of judges to embrace utilitarianism, that might make sense. But other than that, the use of overviews is extremely welcome. And in almost all instances, when you give the 2NR or the 2AR, the top of the debate, unless some big mistake has been made, needs to be an impact overview in order to assess and evaluate the debate for the judge. So if you get in the habit of explaining the impact in an overview, it doesn't get lost in line by line. You've prioritized it. Also, the most powerful part of a disadvantage or an affirmative is the impact. So explaining it first gives a reason for the judge to continue to care and to be engaged in that portion of the debate. Beyond that, it also puts arguments in, you can also put arguments in them like impact turns the case, means they can't solve or happens faster. Also, there's reasons to prefer. Some of the things can be time frame, probability, an ethical reason to prefer it. You can have some totally separate framing argument with criticisms or even with just AF impact sequencing arguments about why yours is an impact filter that can, for instance, that democracy argument that I started earlier, if we, prevent democratic backsliding here in the United States, then that is a filter that if we re-promote that can prevent other forms of conflict, not just like one. So, if you can create these international coalitions that can prevent hotspots from arising through that cooperation, that can be something that can not just solve one instance of US-Russian war, but something that could solve multiple hotspots that could arise and kind of develop as a sequencing argument. Or it could be just like questions of epistemology come first, or questions of systemic violence come first. Whatever it might be, that sequencing argument can be put in the overview. Beyond that, there's also magnitude, whatever it is, but you should have that prioritization of what your impact is going to be inside of that overview to make sure that your impact is given, the impact debate is given the priority that it deserves. The next thing is to rely on evidence as much as possible. Evidence is useful for impact comparisons if you can find evidence that supports the assertion you have on the impact debate. It will absolutely help you. One of the reasons is because there's a strange bias we have towards providing evidence in debate, but also because the judge can call for evidence at the end. So a lot of times the judge won't have your analytical arguments or feel compelled to reread your analytical arguments. So if one team is doing great analytical comparison, one team reads a card on an issue, a lot of the times it's going to be the team that reads the piece of evidence that gets the nod because of how kind of both biased we are towards the opinion of others that we present inside of debates, but also because it's something that the judge can revisit and reread. If you're negative, you can read several impact framing cards in the block, and the 1AR may have a hard time answering them. I'd encourage those going against a framing affirmative, for instance, to read lots of framing arguments to continue bolstering the credibility of your disad on that portion of the debate. If you're negative, you can, or if the 1AR reads several cards on the impact debate, it can absolutely skew the speech time and make it very difficult for the 1NR to come back. In a debate that I watched yesterday, I saw one defensive card read against Warming in the 1AR, and it absolutely skewed the 2NR time and was something that was difficult to bounce back from. So if there's just one, if you can read multiple, it can be something that is absolutely in your favor. Also, people usually don't answer pieces of impact framing evidence to the same extent as others. Even within impact framing debates, when the AF has a framing contention, a lot of that is just shadow extensions and there's not really a purpose to it. So if you really make kind of the development of impact framing pieces of evidence either to help your disadvantage or to help your affirmative, and you get good at explaining those as reasons to prefer your impacts, and don't talk about them in isolation, but really talk about them in the context of your specific impact, it can be something that can radically change the way that your debate is carried out. Also, let me give you one example for that. So this has been, 12 or 13 years, but there was a great team from Meadows, Bobby, and Jeremy, and they had an AF where the primary impact was bird flu. Now, at the time, bird flu was not something that I think the average American took very seriously, and the impact defense tended to be really good against that. Even more so is that the AF impact evidence on the bird flu wasn't well warranted, but it was very powerful in its conjecture of the ability to get to extinction. And so what that Meadows team did was create our impact comes first because we have the most qualified person in the discussion of bird flu. So basically it was qualifications are more important than warrants. Like someone who's the most qualified person in the world on bird flu, which is kind of what they claimed their author was, we don't need the warrants behind their conjecture in order to get that, because there's no other person more qualified. And they won countless debates, just not because that was the best argument, but because they were best prepared to defend that angle to their impact about why that impact should come before any other impact. And they even leveraged that kind of authority to say, your author is not the foremost authority on U.S.-Russian war, etc. But we have, ours should be considered more credible because we have the foremost intelligence on that issue. To continue, it can also be very helpful to read articles from people who explain risk. So, there's a journal called Risk Analysis. There's also the Global Catastrophic Risks, each of which you can read. A lot of it's going to be boring and to deal with lots of mathematical equations, but if you can find the articles from those sources that discuss risk calculus versus large catastrophic accounts, it can be something that is extremely helpful when approaching the subject and can help you debate the risk. And especially if you stop reading evidence that everyone's reading inside of debates, you read different evidence that you've cut yourself, it can be a real game changer because it's not the same thing that judges have heard every debate, and you've done some more research and taken a different angle than other teams. Okay, so the last one of these I stole from an old lecture by Callum Matheson, and it was something that I've had a lot of experience debating when I was in college, and that is to make your impact lurid or vivid. A lot of times we kind of in debate create a disconnect between the impact itself and the reality of what the impact might look like. We very easily talk about nuclear war or global warming and extinction and destruction, but we don't really provide a picture for what that constitutes. And debaters like Callum were very good at providing and showing a story or a picture of what that impact would look like and how it would manifest. And in that story might also talk about how it interacted with the impact that the other team was presented. Another debater that always used to kick my butt inside of debates was Greta Stahl from Michigan State. And I actually saw a debate once where she started making the sound effects inside of debate, like boom, for nuclear war against a team that was reading a more systemic impact in order to just provide something different. So creating a vision of what your impact might look like, I wouldn't go over the top here, but a short amount is able to kind of differentiate and provide a seriousness and make yourself different than other debates, and also recapture your judge's attention. So some things that you could do in order to do that is read some fiction, especially fiction that can deal with maybe dystopias or bad events, and kind of study how they can paint a picture and in a very short word economical form in order to be able to use that to make your impacts seem very large. Also, you can reference movies or TV shows or popular culture that kind of demonstrate what your impact might look like. And that can also just, we all like to talk about pop culture, and it can be something that it also provides some fun and an automatic connection to something. And the other thing is to really create an image. And so harken back to your English days where your show not tell that your English teachers have you do when writing essays, and using an aspect of that inside of your impact analysis can be something that is extremely useful. So in conclusion, I would like to just reiterate some things that you should think about. These are just some impact games that you could debate on both sides in order to try and evaluate those different values we talked about in examining impacts when we discussed kind of the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode. But here are a couple more that you could do in your own time to debate against yourself or to debate against your partner that can be good impact tools. And thank you to the coach of Westminster, Jordana Sternberg, for suggesting these practices. But here's one. Have a full merit scholarship to the 25th. Would you rather have a full merit scholarship to the 25th ranked college with a special recognition and privileges for your academic skill, or attend a top 5 college, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Stanford, etc., with no special honors and pay full price? Or would you rather go to a party at a friend's house, even though her little brother had a terrible stomach bug yesterday? Or stay home from the party to make sure you don't get the germs? Now, you have to weigh the cost-benefit analysis with both of these exercises, but what the importance of it and what I want you to get for it is to realize that the impacts are different, and what makes them different is the values that underlie them. Do you, to go back to the one that we discussed before, do you value more living close to your job or having a large house and everything to do with it? And the more that you kind of break that down and use what you get from valuing your impact to also solve aspects of the other choices offense, then you can really use that critical thinking skills to try and persuade someone to go to what the side that you value most. But it should be those values and a recognition that those values are not the same as a starting point to examine impact calculus. Well, this is part 1 of 2. Part 2 will deal with more explicitly probability, magnitude, and time frame, as well as a broader discussion of ethics. But this has been Josh Clark discussing part 1 of Impact Calculus, How to Win. I hope this was informative, and please feel free to contact me at josh.clark@montgomerybell.edu if you have any questions.